Hello, welcome. I'm Katie Adams, curator at the Tread of Pioneers Museum, and I'm here to bring you this week's virtual brown bag storytelling series. This year, instead of in-person presentations, we have selected past brown bags to show you from the comfort and safety of your home. Now, our friends at South Route generously shared some of the early and interesting history of the Oak Creek Egeria Park area in a 2015 presentation held at the Methodist Church. In this presentation, you'll hear from Museum Director at the Tracks and Trails Museum, Nita Naugle, as well as her mother, Rita Herold, who's the caretaker of the Yampa Egeria Historical Society. The two teamed up to bring us this presentation. Now, Rita also recently released a book called Yampa Valley's Lost Egeria Park. It's a great resource, has lots of fantastic photos, and it's definitely worth picking up a copy. You can find more on our website at treadofpioneers.org for up-to-date events, news, and much more. Thanks.
This is my mom, Rita Herold, and of course I'm Nita Naugle, and we live in the South Route area. I've lived there most of my life. I've moved other places, but I wound up back there. My family had a family ranch. It's a fifth-generation ranch, so very comfortable and familiar with the history of the area and learning more all the time because, as you know, those of you that are a little bit older, a lot of you have lived the history in the area, so that always helps when you're exploring and discovering. There we go. All right, now that I've mastered this, we'll continue on. I'm with the Tracks and Trails Museum, the Historical Society of Oak Creek and Phippsburg. We have two historical societies in South Route. We have the Historical Society in Oak Creek and Phippsburg, and then, of course, Mom's, the Yampa Egeria Historical Society. I work for the museum. I'm paid part-time, and we rely upon our volunteers, which we have amazing volunteers. And of course, Mom is a volunteer for their historical society, and they rely exclusively on volunteers. So if you're looking for a hobby and you want something to do, you're welcome to come up to South Route. One of the fun things about working in this community is all the museums and historical societies have similar stories because the people not only, traveled from one place to the other, but a lot of times they moved to different locations. So our perspective in South Route might be a little different than the steamboat perspective. For example, Crochet Lake, and that area there was a property first purchased by the Perry girls, and that was the original site plan for the Perry Mansfield School. So our perspective is up on that end. That was the first purchase, and then they decided not to do it. My former historian says that it was probably because they were a little bit worried about all those nymphs dancing around the woods so close to the miners in the area. The other perspective that's a little different, same person but a little bit different direction, is Carl Hallison. Of course, you're very familiar with Hallison Hill and the ski history of the area because they do a lovely job about it. Well, in South Route, he was also influential. He helped create the Yampa and Oak Creek ski clubs at that time as well. He also was a carpenter by trade, and so the Craig Museum has a lot of history on him building different buildings and different buildings throughout the county. So just a little different perspective, same person, and that's what makes it so fascinating. Let's see. I'm going to do a brief overview of kind of some of the things in the area, and then we'll go into the fun stuff, the stories. Of course, the Anglo-Americans in this area settled this area a lot later than other areas in Colorado. And gold was discovered in Hans Peak in 1861. In 1873, the White River Agency was formed. And then the first pioneers started coming into Steamboat area in 1875. Right after that, 1876, Colorado becomes a state. In the 1880s, Yampa area settled. This is the Watson Homestead by the Laughlin Buttes. That was one of the early homesteads of the area. And then we had the 20 Mile Park area. This is the Foydle School. And the Foydle family settled in that area. And the reason I specifically chose this particular side is you can see the schoolhouse there. The school wasn't formed until a lot later, but we are in the process of restoring that particular building. It's on the Peabody and mine area, and so that's one of our fun and exciting projects that we're doing. The Foydle family lived there for a short time. The wife passed away. She was very ill and got sick, and of course, you know, at times were tough, and they moved out of the area. But their legacy, they were well liked. Their legacy still lives on by many of the features being named after them. So that's the Foydle area. The first homestead in Oak Creek, the Myers Homestead. And so this is kind of just bringing it right along. This is in about 1890.
How big are those homesteads?
They're pretty small, actually. Especially when they were first built. I know the one near our house, it's now a section of a barn that's still there. There was a homestead right there on the corner. We live on the road to the cemetery, and it was smaller. And then a few years later, they built a little bit bigger home.
I'm sorry, when you say homestead, you just actually mean the physical building?
Yeah, I was referring to the building there. Mom can enlighten you more on the size of the homesteads.
Yeah, they were 160 acres, most of them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
by law, you had to have at least a 12 by 14 foot structure. So a lot of them were about that size.
Yeah. And so today's standards, that's pretty small.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then we had, then you start seeing a lot of the rural schools popping up in the 1800s. I have pictured here the Upper Egeria School and then also the Palace School. The Palace School was one of the first schools in the Oak Creek, Phippsburg area. It sat between the two towns, and it was quite early. At this point, people started paying attention to the land around the area and the coal. The rich coal fields of Oak Creek and the Oak Hills were very noted. This is a wagon mine, and that's how they started out, was the small wagon mines that they could go in and out, and it was small scale mining, and then it got bigger as time went on. Of course, in the state, David Moffett started, and some of the influential people out of the state realized that there was a rich coal fields of the area, and because of that, they started bringing in the railroad tracks. The train reached the area in 1908. That was when it reached Oak Creek, and it was very important it reached Oak Creek because that was the pay at the end of the line. And then later on, the tracks were moved on to Steamboat Springs. So by now, Oak Creek's a booming, thriving town because there's money to be made. This is 1910, Oak Creek. And so 100 years ago, that's kind of a pivotal slide just because it's 100 years ago and everybody can remember that. Oak Creek was very large. Oak Creek had over 2,000 residents. Oak Creek had 3 churches, the Methodist, Episcopal, and the Catholic Church. Oak Creek boasted being the center of the best coal district in Colorado. Oak Creek had $12,000 sanitary sewer system and a installed 30,000 waterworks system. Oak Creek had one of the most modern equipped small hospitals in the state. And Oak Creek was the only town in northwestern Colorado with an established payroll of more than 75,000 distributed monthly. We're back in 1915, 100 years ago, so that was pretty significant. And so that's just kind of a cap or overview. I know I left lots of the interesting history out, but I wanted to kind of get our feet wet slowly. So I'm going to turn it over to Mom.
What's the population now?
The population now is 800 people right in there. And that 2,000 people that were there 100 years ago, that's not counting in a 4 to 5 mile radius where they had about additional 5,000 to 6,000 people because of the mines. So it was very populated.
And I'm going to step us back just a little in time to the 1880s. Yampa was a little different foundation than Oak Creek. Yampa was started out as being a rural and agricultural area rather than the coal mines being the most influential part. Now, as Nita kind of mentioned, the towns worked together very, very closely. They depended on each other at that time. Well, there. In 1902, this was what Yampa looked like. But in the 1880s, there wasn't even those buildings there at where the present site of Yampa is now. It was almost all homesteads and homestead cabins. One of the interesting people of the area, I'm going to tell you one of the stories of one of the families and the hardships that they had when they first came into the area. Louisa and her husband, William Montgomery, settled about 1/2 mile southeast of Yampa on November 3rd, 1882. She told the following story to her granddaughter, Ida Montgomery. My husband and I, with our 4 children, came from Kokomo, Colorado, over what is now the Gore Road. From Kokomo, we came to Dillon on the stage. At Dillon, we hired 2 men and teams to bring us on over. The trail, which had not been traveled in some time, had to be recut, and progress was very slow. There was heavy snow, and we were loaded too heavily. We had to leave part of our provisions on top of the range. Mr. Montgomery, on a previous trip to this country, had built a small, 1-room cabin, but as lumber was not obtainable, it did not have a floor. When we arrived the night of November 3rd, there was no snow, but the next morning, everything was white, and remained so until late in the spring. Our only worry that winter was to get settled and keep the wolf from our door. Because contrary to nearly everyone's idea of pioneer life, there were no Indians here, as we came the year after the Indian massacre of Meeker and all the Indians had been driven out of the country. There was an abundance of wild game. We had plenty of bread, but vegetables were very scarce. We only brought 600 pounds of potatoes, most of which we had to keep to plant. We had a small amount of canned goods. For some time after we came, a wash tub and boiler were our only table. We bought some lumber at Elk River for $60 and $1,000, and paid a man $5 a day to get it out. We then floored the cabin. The next spring, we cleared 25 acres of land by hand because we did not get a team until late in the year of 1883. and no people who had teams were asking such high prices for their labor that we could not afford to hire help. In the latter part of June 1883, we had cleared enough ground for a garden. A short time later, there was a great freeze which froze all the gardens but ours. That left a scarcity of feed, because it was impossible to get to Denver that year until late in July for supplies. But in early days, what belonged to one was shared by everyone. This particular slide is another family that came into the area in 1885. This is Robert Laughlin family. And I'd like to share their story with you also. Not far from the gold rush at Victor and Cripple Creek, Robert knew prospecting, minerals, and what to seek. He located a couple of claims. One was the Redbird, one of the very best and richest around, I've heard. But ultra rich, the Laughlins were not to be. Robert had no capital for development, you see. The claim and all was cheaply sold to others, and they went west again with his wife's brothers. By now, Robert and Frances had children numbering 5, all busy and active, worse than a beehive. Walter and Benny riding horses, drawing a rope, both big enough to help push cows along at a lope. Bertha and Mabel to help look after baby Tom. At age 2, all he could do was ride along. Up west from Colorado Springs into South Park. Trails, canyons, roads, definitely with rocks, very sharp. 2 wagons, several horses, a small bunch of cows. Everything this little family owned right now. Alas, the rocks made the cattle's feet very sore. They could not be persuaded to travel 1 mile more. Now the horses had shoes and were walking quite fine. It was just the cattle that would not stay in line. After giving it some thought, Robert knew what to do. Horseshoes they had in plenty. They could be cut in 2. The cattle were roped and throwed, the shoes nailed on. The cows, now able to walk, it wouldn't take them long. They arrived at Ed Watson's place in South Rock County. For the homestead's rights, they paid a small bounty. Our many wandering and moving days are past, Frances exclaimed. Under these buttes, we are home at last. Bob, Maud, Ruth, Gordon, Theresa were all added to the clan to feed and keep 10 children. Busy was the plan. The boys all cut and worked with leather and rawhide, braided it into quirts, nosebands, quirts to cut, help them ride. They planted several patches of potatoes each spring. They plowed and dug. It was enough to make their heads ring. All potatoes were planted under the quaky trees, patches on each side of the valley to avoid the freeze. After planting many a spot and using many a sack, the boys lost potato seed out the wagon back. Now, Robert was proud of his horses, especially old Nick. Nick won most races where he was entered. He was quick. You have heard of the Western Quarter Horse Association. Well, old Nick was one of the first in that association. At a race in Hayden, the starter yelled, "Go, go!" As Robert kicked Nick, he answered, "I thought you said ho." In spite of the stock saddle and the staples, Nick could run. Even with a slow start and extra weight, old Nick won. Would you believe that Robert was never known to cuss? Even still, he could certainly kick up a fuss. When he was irate, he would yell with a decided ring, "You dag-taken, tomfool thing!" Time passes. Nothing seems to last. We've been talking about things long past. Children grow up and get married and move away. So you won't find the name Laughlin in South Route today. Except when you drive down State Highway 131, 2 miles north of Yampa, looking towards the setting sun, you will see the Laughlin Buttes, still standing serene, surveying the southern Yampa Valley terrain. I included those just to give you a little bit of feeling for what it was like before the railroad came. By 1910, after the railroad came, Yampa got many, many houses. I think the newspaper at the time mentioned that there was a boom. They had 100 houses built in town between those times of 1903, when the railroad survey came, and 1915. One of the things that allowed that big boom in time was the sawmills. Again, the Yampa Leader, or the newspaper in Yampa at that time, said there were 23 sawmills in South Route County. Now, some of those sawmills were one family owned and quite small, but those mills allowed people not only to build houses, but they included such things as letting those people start sending mine props down to the mines. They included railroad ties for the railroad. There were whole areas cleared by hand and broad axes, and those tie hacks, as they were called, did not use a mill. They just used broad axes to hack out the railroad ties. So the lumber industry was extremely important. But one of the things that we don't think about that lumber was made into, they used local lumber to make shook, or the thin slats for the crates, for the lettuce industry and the other items that were sent out on the railroad. You may have heard that the lettuce industry in South Route actually was quite large during the 1920s. The industry sent trains out. Some of those train cars were sent as far as New York City to the Waldorf Astoria, where they advertised South Route County lettuce. One of the other things that were sent out with produce that we don't hear about that often is South Route sent potatoes out on the railroad. They sent spinach. The spinach industry lasted longer than the lettuce industry. There was a fellow by the name of Jack Holden in Toponas that sent spinach out on the railroad up until the 1950s. Jack Holden also owned the Toponas store at that time.
Was it mainly the railroad workers who bought the new homes that were built?
No. There was very few railroad workers that bought those homes. There were such people as Judge Carl, Judge, can't remember his name. He was one of the county judges. He built a house in Yampa. It was a very nice house. He then became judge of the county, and so he moved to Hans Peak. because that's where the county seat was at the time. And he sold his house to Louis Phillips. And the house still sits in Yampa. It is there. A lot of those houses that were built in that time frame between 1908 and 1930 are still standing in Yampa. Come to a walking tour, you'll see a lot of those same buildings.
That's great, that's wonderful. The town just sort of grew up into a town and grew up into a town.
It was one of the ones that they claimed was not platted as a town site. It grew naturally.
Yeah.
And that's a quote out of the Yampa Leader.
That's great. That's great. You know, another question I have, if I may, is
Sure.
it okay if I, just as these towns like this kind of all grew up, you mentioned that during a certain time, schools all of a sudden started up. Now, how was that met with the parents? Did they lose some of their labor force, or were they happy to have schools for the kids to go to?
They were very happy. A lot of those early settlers worked very hard to send their children to school. Many of the one-room schools were summer schools, but there were others that were wintertime schools. The ones up around Egeria Park, one of the King Mountain schools, was a wintertime school, and that was Preston King, who then later in his life moved here to Steamboat. And his family and the Crossan family went to a wintertime school. Some of the summertime school would meet maybe a month or two in the summer and then close until the next summer. The kids would attend school when they didn't have to have help in the fields. One of the families, the Albert family up the Yampa River, towards where Yamcola is now, rode for about 8 miles a day to attend that first Watson school there where the present Yampa Cemetery is now. So they valued their schooling.
Thank you.
Rita, could you tell me please what's the origin of the name Egeria?
Okay, yes. Egeria covers an area in the South Round. It stretches from Red Dirt Divide between McCoy and goes down, and even the old timers disagreed on where Egeria was located. Some of them said it quit at just below Phippsburg. Others claimed, and Dave Gray was one of those, claimed it went on and took in what is now Stagecoach Reservoir. It is the whole basin. Upper Egeria is what we know as the Toponis area, and it has Egeria Creek, and then some people still call that area Egeria Park today. But the early settlers called Egeria Park clear down to, well, my family said Phippsburg, but just below that, there's a small divide there just below.
Is it a
Phippsburg
Indian
and
name?
Toponis.
The actual name?
It is out of mythology, Greek mythology.
Oh.
Roman mythology. One of them, it was either Greek or Roman, I'm not sure which now. When the early people came in, Berthard was one of them, and there was some of the others that were guiding them. There were several people, again, they argue over who named it. Governor Gilpin might have been instrumental. Berthard himself might have been the one that named it. But it was named after a Roman goddess, Egeria, and she was the goddess or water sprite. She was the goddess of the waters and the springs. So that was a green area. They came out and they looked out and said, "Oh, it's beautiful, it's all green. I name you Egeria." And that was the legend behind it.
Thank you.
look back to see where I got.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. I love the questions. Okay, again, talking about South Route and how they are all interrelated. The labor force for the lettuce industry came from all over. The different homesteaders, a lot of them grew small patches of lettuce on their place. Others plowed up in many acres for the lettuce. This, to get labor forces for these different fields, some of those people came by train from Oak Creek. Mike Urich mentioned that his mother rode the chain in the morning to Yampa, worked in the lettuce sheds and packed the lettuce into those crates made from the shuck that came off of the hills there, one of them being Green Ridge. And then that evening, Mrs. Urich would ride back down to Oak Creek on the train. So the valley was integrated together quite tightly at that time. Some of the things that you may not know that they were able to grow in those early days. We had strawberries on that end of the valley also. You had strawberries here in Strawberry Park. They grew strawberries in Yampa. Not something that was stable enough to be sent out on the railroad, but they sold them to the miners. They grew parsnips, they grew turnips, they grew all of those root vegetables and sold them to the towns that were closer by. Okay, it wasn't all work. They had fun too. They enjoyed picnics. They enjoyed rodeos. This particular rodeo was being held on the school grounds below where the schoolhouse sat and still sits. They didn't build an arena. They went around the outside of the area with their buggies, their cars, or whatever they had, their horses, and that was their whole way that they kept the bucking horses or the stock for roping contained. The Moffett Avenue. Moffett Avenue is a wide street. It's 100 feet wide. My grandfather said that when they first started building Yampa, the street was narrower than that. They had a vote to see who was going to have to move their houses to make that street wider. Okay, there were about 3 businesses on the north side of the street. There was only one at the meeting that was on the south side of the street. Guess who had to move his house? The Hernage store had to be moved further away from the Moffett Avenue. It is now 100 feet wide. Not only did they have bucking horses at that time that entertained the people on Moffett Avenue, still today, on the 4th of July, we have broom polo that takes place on that street. Okay, another thing that was very popular with those early settlers was the entertaining their visitors and their families who came from outside the area and taking them to Trapper's Lake to fish, or perhaps up on Gore to fish. But fishing and camping was very popular even at that time. Okay, this one is a boxing match in Oak Creek, and one of the things that was fun to note was in the Yampa Leader maintained that A fellow by the name of Billy McFarland was to fight a boxing match in the town of Oak Creek. And you know, they never did say who won that match.
Do you want to tell more about that, Scott?
So they had, of course, entertainment, sports was a great way to pass the time. And this was at the grandstands. It was near the school at that time. And they had horses races next to it. There was a field nearby, and they had horse races, and they played baseball. They'd have their first aid competitions here, that sort of thing. So it kind of leads into diving into some of the family history of the area. I'll get pretty specific. One of the things I'm kind of paying tribute to Mike Urich. Mike Urich passed away on the 20th. He's our historian up there in South Route in Oak Creek. And one of the stories that he told me quite often, and I decided that I just had to share it anyway. So he told the story of his parents' wedding. Okay, to tell the story of the wedding of my parents, you must visualize what was happening in Oak Creek around 1920. Oak Creek was a booming coal mining area. There was the Victor American, the Moffat, the Keystone, Haybro, and a number of other wagon mines. The larger mines included a company town which was owned by the mine company. This included houses for employees, a company store, and sometimes a pool hall or dance hall for the camp residents. Oak Creek was the center for their shopping and entertainment. Oak Creek had 3 or 4 stores which also carried general merchandise. There were 2 movie houses, the Amos and the Princess, the Routt County Bank, the Laughlin Drug Store, Morgan Drug Store, Williams Hardware, Bell Lumber Company, Chaffee Lumber Yard, Raff and Jewelry Store, and a number of other shops that sold everything from women's hats to tailor-made suits for men. There also were a number of pool halls and restaurants. The Dalmatia Restaurant, the Tavern Cafe, the Vienna Cafe, the Liberty Cafe, the Greek Pool Hall, the Merchants Cafe, the Colorado Cafe, the Billings Cafe, and the Oak Creek Pastime Pool Hall, and several more. 3 barbershops with 2 to 4 chairs, and they were open from 8 to 6 days a week. The Oak Creek area was growing fast. The people came from nearly every country in the world. There was a large group from Italy, Mexico, Japan, Greece, Germany, Eastern Europe, and everywhere else. Most of the miners were single, and the families that came were very much appreciated by the single men who became uncles to their children of the families that were here. Usually, they made arrangements to board with the family, which meant they would take their meals and usually have their laundry done by the women of the family. This really helped a lot of families because the extra money was needed with so many children. My father, Frank Urich, arrived in America in July of 1914. He left Croatia, which is part of the Austro-Hungary Empire. The empire encompassed all of Eastern Europe countries today. The people who came from the area considered themselves to be Austrians, and once in America, they usually came together as one big family. Lodges and organizations sprang up to form unity among such a large group of people. There are interesting stories of survival the young men did to cope with the language. Eastern Europeans were mostly of Slavic origin, so their language similarity enabled them to communicate with each other. But the English language was a problem. My father told how they were able to know which bus or streetcar they needed to take to work. They would tie colored strings on the bus or streetcar, and this is in New York. They used to get to work and get home. It was a good system until the day they took the streetcar to the station shop and had them cleaned. All the strings were taken off, and the men had a hard time finding the right one to get home. My father said he had to supply his own shovel to work, and the day he got lost, he walked around for a couple of days pretending to work. He eventually found his way back to his batch. This is what they called small one-room living quarters for single men. He was too embarrassed to ask someone because he didn't know English or the name of the street he lived on. He quickly learned English. Rose Brokovich, Mike's mother, Rose Brokovich, was born in America shortly after her parents immigrated from Slovenia. From Illinois coal fields, when Rose was 19, she moved to Colorado to live with an older married sister. Her brother-in-law moved to Oak Creek to work at the Victor American mine. My mother went too because nearly everyone else had found work there. Rose and Frank met and were married in 1924. And he has a little bit on the wedding. The wedding of Frank and Rose Urich. What a big wedding. To this day, there has never been a wedding in Oak Creek as big as my parents'. My father brought dresses for all the bridesmaids, and there were 8 with 2 flower girls and the bride. Father Myers came from Steamboat to perform the ceremony in the Catholic chapel in the mortuary on Main Street. The photographer, Mr. Welch, from Craig, Colorado, came to take the wedding pictures. They paid him a sum of $50 in gold for his service. After the ceremony, in a jam-packed chapel, the entire wedding party walked the Pearson Auditorium where the wedding photos were taken. Then the party paraded its way through the streets of Oak Creek to Schimpf's Addition, and that's where the real entertainment began. There were several hundred Slavic people, single men and families, many of them with young daughters, and they celebrated throughout Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. Accordion music was furnished by 2 men who took turns playing. One of the musicians was Louis Bruder. He was an excellent accordion player, and there were others that played the baccarat. Traditional foods were prepared, roast goat, lamb, and a pig prepared to a custom that is, the small pig was roasted whole with his head attached and placed on a table with an apple in its mouth. Different types of homemade sausages. There were lots of sarma, stuffed cabbage, homemade sauerkraut, homemade noodles, along with breads, potasia, which is a nut roll, homemade slavich, a strong plum brandy, beer, a homemade wine. One of the customs of all that danced with the bride pinned an offering of money on her dress. Another was the shower of gold. A whole lap of gold coins and golden articles were collected by my aunt from my mother's dowry. There also was a custom of trying to break a dish with a coin by throwing it at the dish, which was placed some distance away. It is said that over $700 in gold was collected. Parties and chivalries came to the house many times during the evening and the following days. Each time a collection was taken by the people in the house, and the crowd, whoever they were showered with coins. When my parents got married, February 1924, the Klan was busy campaigning throughout the county, and they did win control of the county in the 1924 election. It must have caused quite a stir in Oak Creek Klan meetings when Rose Brokovich married Frank Urich. They married at the Catholic chapel on Main Street with a large number of Slavic people in attendance. The entire group walked to the Pearson building to have their photos, and of course they walked the entire Main Street back up the avenue where the wedding celebration lasted for those 3 days and 3 nights. The wedding couple rented a small house on Grant Avenue. The interview with my mother said that one night she awoke and looked out the bedroom window and saw a large burning cross on the hill near her house. She said, "I had a wonderful, excited feeling of visions from heaven." She thought her wedding was blessed. It was quite a bit later before she realized the significance of the KKK and what that cross meant. By 1925, the Klan folded throughout the nation. In Georgia, there were investigated for tax fraud. In Denver, it was the handling of the Klan funds. And in Oak Creek, the banker with his bank clerk took off to Mexico with the bank money. So that was kind of a fun story he liked to tell.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
The other one that I'm going to talk about is about Miss Tirsa Shepherd. and Mike Urich also collected this story. And she wrote back to him, or wrote about what he had asked her to get him. And she says, Mike Urich, a former student and good friend, asked me to write a few lines giving my impression of Oak Creek when I first arrived in September of 1932. My arrival in Oak Creek was complete and total disaster. I haven't the words to give my impression of Oak Creek at that time. I had left a good job in Denver as a secretary to the manager of Denver Post to come to Oak Creek and teach school. I had hoped to make a good impression when I arrived. However, I came by train, and after going through the tunnels, my clothes were covered with soot from the steam engine. My hands and face were dirty. I was tired and hungry, and there was no one to meet me. I sat and waited in a dreary little station for nearly an hour while the person who was to meet me was out fishing. If there had been another train back to Denver that day, I would have been on it. However, since that memorable day, I have met some wonderful people, including my husband, J.R. Shorty Hannity, and they all have helped change my impression of Oak Creek. Tirsa Shepherd Hannity. J.R. Shorty Hannity. Joseph Remo Hannity, forever known as Shorty, was born in a small mining town near Wilsonburg, Colorado in 1903. He was the youngest of 5 children. His parents immigrated from Italy in 1902 to the southern part of Colorado. His family name was spelled Amade, but in America it changed to Hannity because of the pronunciation. The older children were born in Italy. In fact, the oldest brother, Roberto, was 3 years old when the family left and had to wait in Italy until they could arrange for his passage. When the time came, he had grown into a young man who had learned to be a bench carpenter. It was 1913 when he finally joined his family in America. Dominic Hannity, Shorty's father, arrived in Oak Creek in 1909, leaving his family in Walsenburg until he found some work. He worked as a carpenter like everyone else. He also worked in the mines. One of the early mines was the Juniper. The family, including Shorty, arrived in Oak Creek in 1911. It was in 1911 that Dominic Hannity, Shorty's father, went together with Octavio Grassi and opened the North Pole Italian store. By 1912, Dominic was able to buy out Octavio and become the sole proprietor. He constructed a large building on West Colfax in Oak Creek between the new bank building and the Bell Lumber Company. Oak Creek was growing. Unfortunately, during the mine strike in 1914-15, he carried too many miners with credit and was forced to close his store. After closing the store, Shorty's father went to Milner, Colorado, where he opened D. Hannity's Bakery. For a while, the empty store building in Oak Creek was used as a town hall, and Oak Creek rented it to hold their meetings. Eventually, the buildings were divided and made into 2 separate houses. Shorty's brother, Edward Hannity, was killed in a mine explosion at the Perry Mine, February 19, 1921. For some reason, Edward had switched shifts with another man, and it was at the end of the shift he was coming out of the shaft when with 2 other miners in that explosion. There were 5 miners total killed. Shorty continued to work with his father in his store, and then he was able to purchase after that and things closed down, he was able to purchase the Hannity hardware store, and a lot of you remember that. He worked there until his retirement. The reason I can say some of you remember the Hannity hardware store is because I can remember it just vaguely.
What is it now?
Right now, it was like the Big Tuna's restaurant, and that closed, so it's sitting vacant. Right next to it is kind of a purchase building for some offices. Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to express, certainly was the generations of history that we do have. And we have it because people write them down. They gather the stories, you know, like my mom, like my grandfather. They talk about the history, like Mike Urich at the Tracks and Trails Museum. This is important. This is something you guys could be doing too. When you see something that brings a note to mind, write it down. It doesn't have to be fancy or simple. It can be a simple 2 or 3 sentences. For example, one of the displays that I have at the Tracks and Trails Museum is on the schools right now of the area. And the Upper Morrison Creek School, I was talking to a man that came in, and just briefly, he told me, his name was Donald McElhaney, and he told me that he remembers when he was really young walking to the Morrison Creek School. He caught a mouse as he was going to school and put it in a matchbox. When he got to school, he placed it upon his desk. His teacher asked him what was in the box. Donald replied, "You don't want to know what's in there." Of course, the teacher opened the box and got quite a scare. So it can be as simple as that. Your stories have value. Right now at the Tracks and Trails Museum, I never thought I would be doing it. I'm explaining to classes and kids what a rotary dial telephone is. So you guys and your stories are important. Write them down or share them. The Trout Creek School brings to mind, as I was doing this research, I had another gentleman come in and talk to me. And I asked him about his teachers and going to school at the Trout Creek School. And this is what he said. When asked to remember a teacher that you had, without hesitation, John Chavez, a soft, well-spoken older gentleman, replied, "Yes, a Mrs. Gray." John attended school at the Apex Mine, known as Trout Creek School, from about 1943 to 1947. He attended the school when he was 8.5 to 11 years of age. When John was in the 3rd grade, he couldn't read. Mrs. Gray administered an eye test and found that I couldn't even see the board. She put me in a special class and sat me a few feet from the board. It was thoughtful and inciting. I learned to read. John later moved to California, became a teacher, principal, and superintendent of schools, an advocate of education. So I just wanted to kind of bring that home because it's important that you pass along your knowledge that you have. What you lived through, I haven't lived through. What Mom lived through, I haven't lived through. What my grandfather lived through, or my great-grandfather, those stories I wouldn't know unless they weren't shared. So I guess I'm on my soapbox saying that what you have to share is important as well. And at this point, I just want to give a brief update, and then I'll have Mom give you an update. At the Tracks and Trails Museum, we are gearing up for the Labor Day weekend celebrations. So we have lots of different activities. We have free tours on the Sunday before Labor Day. We do a mine tour with Paul Bonnenfield, and then we do a tour out to the foot of school with Linda Long, and she also talks about the history of the mining of the area as well. We participate in the parades, we do fundraisers, we have a little store across the street from the museum that we have a lot of volunteers sewing and making really nice gifts. So please join us for Labor Day weekend, you're more than welcome, and we have lots going on, so check out our website if you do that, or else just come by and visit us. So I'm going to pass this to Mom.
And if I may, before you do that, thank you very, very much for that tribute to Mike Urich. That was fantastic. He was part of the history and wrote the history and captured the history of South Round and Oakwood for so long. And his passing is part of the scene. But thank you very much for that tribute.
You know, when I was thinking about what to do and what to say, Mike was on my mind.
Yeah.
And I couldn't do it without him, and the things that I learned in the brief time I worked at the Tracks and Trails Museum were invaluable. And I will never know what he knew because he had a wealth of information in just his little tiny fingertip. And if I am able to pass on a fraction of that, that's part of the reason why I was there when I was there. So, yes, he was very instrumental in the foundation of the Oak Creek Tracks and Trails Museum in the area. So, yeah, you tell me.
Yeah, and I think rather than me saying anything more about what we're doing, because we're kind of laid back for the rest of the summer, our big whoopie-doos usually occur on the 4th of July, or around there, the 3rd of July. But what I'd like to do right now, I think, is just ask if you have any questions, or I would entertain comments from you folks. Yes?
I've heard two different stories about the Royal Hotel. One story was that Teddy Roosevelt had some influence into the origination that the hotel was built. And then the other one came out shortly after it burned last winter, that no, he did not. So what do you know about the hotel and connection particularly with Roosevelt?
Okay, yes, I've heard that, and it's up for debate. It's like a lot of the oral stories. We really don't know. At the time the Royal was built in 1903, and Teddy Roosevelt had come into the area prior to that. I believe it was in 1901 or 1902. And according to the legend is that, in the handed down stories, he said Yampa really needs to have a hunting lodge here. And whether Teddy Roosevelt actually had some money put into that or not, I have no idea. But Lynn Lindsay did make the build the Royal Hotel the next year, and he built the first section of it. It wasn't until about 2 or 3 years later that it was built in the C shape that it then was in until the 1950s or thereabouts, when they put the roof over the top and made it into a rectangular
Did
shape.
Roosevelt ever come back after that first hunting trip?
Not as far as I know.
He didn't come back to the area then?
No,
Okay.
and he did go over the flat tops.
Right.
He was
I
in
knew
Meeker
that.
at that time. The only other claim to fame that the Royal had was the, well, two things. Zane Grey came in and was in Yampa, or Egeria as he called it in his books. And he stayed, and we don't know for sure whether he stayed in the Antlers or the Royal. But he stayed in the area, and then he camped out up at Stillwater, or where Stillwater Reservoir is now. The other one is that they claimed that the Wild Bunch stayed in the Royal Hotel at one time, but there again, that's legend. We have no proof of that. And then, of course, the Royal Hotel had the so-called Rufus the Ghost. And I would like to know where Rufus is now.
we don't know where Rufus
Is he in the top of the Crossings building? Or perhaps he's over in the top of the Masonic Lodge? Or who knows?
Yes, ma'am, if I may, Mrs. Herold, can I?
Yes.
5 generations, your family raised cattle and made a living, and went from the summer session, putting hay up, feeding the herd, and doing that year after year. Could you talk a little bit about some of the certainties and uncertainties and difficulties in doing that?
Yes. The slide that you saw of the Laughlin family was my great-grandfather. And he homesteaded at where the Yampa Cemetery is, well, he had a homestead there also. But he bought the Watson Homestead, and then he was there in that area. We still have that place. We are on have much of the same ranch that he had. Yes, it is very uncertain. There's been a lot of different changes. The cattle were the first part of the industry that we had. Then the slide that you saw of the sawmill on Green Ridge was my other grandfather, and he was a sawmill and a sawyer came in from Texas. And yes, there was many times that the lumber industry saved the ranch because the ranch didn't pay, or vice versa. The lumber industry got in a world of hurt there for a while, and my grandfather lost everything he had, except his wife had just applied for a homestead, and so they kept her homestead. So it's been an up and down. My father, at the time he started taking over the place and ranching, the cattle market had gone almost completely under, but the sheep market was up, so he raised sheep. I grew up on a sheep ranch. And after I got married, my husband was a cowboy, and so we started raising cattle again. So it's been and almost always somebody has to work outside the ranch for us to actually make a living. It's not a big enough place to make a living on. You have to do something outside. Except ranching in South Round.
Were most of these communities built close to a river, or where did they get their water? Did they dig wells, or?
Yes, both. The water table, there is almost an underground river under part of the area up there. The water is quite close to the surface. Very good, very drinkable water. The springs that bubble out, there are several natural springs that bubble out, and the people get the water from those springs in that area, or in the early day, in those rather than the actual river. All of the water in that early day, until we and our many myriads of people came in, the water was drinkable right out of the creeks and streams. Of course, it isn't now. There's too big a population.
Did they have to use that for irrigating their vegetables?
Yes. There isn't enough rain in the area to grow dryland crops. Only about wheat would make a crop maybe 1 out of 5 years by 1950. In the 1930s, they figured 1 in 3 years. It is not viable to be a grain farmer now, because you can't put that much money into it to just get a crop 1 out of 5 years. The elevation and the short season just makes it too questionable.
Thank you.
The one thing about the growing seasons, we're about 2 weeks behind them here in Steamboat.
Yeah, just
So we're a
couple
almost
weeks
between
more, yeah.
one and 2 weeks
Yeah.
behind.
Yeah, so that kind of makes a difference on growing season as well. Even the gardens here and the gardens there, and even the berries too. Sometimes we get freezes when you guys don't. So
We're over 1,000 feet higher.
yeah,
Yeah,
1,000
yes.
feet higher.
Yeah.
The elevation from the valley falls really fast. One of the research areas that I was doing by Deponus, it's a little over 8,000 feet. By the time Route County goes into Moffat County, it's just barely over 6,000 feet. So it's a huge difference. When they were building a reservoir up under the flat tops, one of them, they put in for a permit to build this reservoir, and when they were just building the dam higher, they had built the reservoir actually before the Forest Service was even such an entity. But they sent all the speculations and the engineer's report to Washington, and the bureaucrats in Washington would not believe that there was that much fall in elevation. They sent it back 3 times before the engineer finally said, yes, there is that much fall. It is so.
You guys kind of defined the Egeria area. What's considered the Elk Hills area? Is that the Oak Creek area, or does it go all the way down Oak Creek itself, or?
Well, the Elk Hills area is right around the Oak Creek area where a lot of the mines were and around that area around Oak Creek. A lot of times they referred to, before Oak Creek was Oak Creek, they referred to it as the Oak Hills.
The place where the Edna mine was, which some of you will remember, was the Elk Hills mine at one time.
Other questions?
Well, thank you guys. That was fantastic.